Generally, we believe that people should be able to engage in what activities they like, so long as consent is involved. It is, however, important to note that things are a little more complex than that. Consent has its limits, and even if someone consents to something, it does not make that thing morally right. Some things can be consented to, but are still worthy of discouragement through both social and legal means. Examples could include consenting to murder or slavery. It is also important to note the exception for children, who do not have the mental faculties to consent to anything serious. Here, however, I am most interested in discussing the limits of consent when it comes to adults, and to people who we generally believe do have the mental faculties to understand consequences and to therefore consent. Acts which are beyond consent for such a person are acts that we can conclude no sensible person would ever consent to. An act may be so obviously immoral, cruel, or unjust that we can conclude no rational actor would ever give consent to see themselves in that situation. In this situation, it can be concluded they are not a rational actor, which means their ability to consent is clearly infringed, rendering that consent invalid. Coercion or mental illness are the potential causes of such an apparently irrational act of consent. These factors, and potentially others, have destroyed the capacity of the individual to engage in reasonable, informed consent, rendering any consent invalid, as it can be concluded that no rational actor in their right mind would consent. In other words, consent has its limits. When the negatives of an act so obviously outweigh the positives in every conceivable and imaginable way, consent is invalid because consent relies upon a rational actor. This is why consent from a child or someone with severe brain damage or dementia is meaningless. Consent is an important value in transactions between individuals where a rational actor may be justified in consenting. In order to consent to an act, someone must be rational, and there are certain acts that a rational person would never, ever consent to. In these cases, consent is rendered meaningless because their consenting to this act has already given away the fact that they are not rational enough to engage in serious consent.